I am both excited and very fortunate to have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker today at the DDI. That's Dr. Melody Burkins. Dr. Burkins is the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies here at Dartmouth. She also serves as a senior associate director in the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding and as a professor in environmental studies. She has over 30 years of experience on Arctic issues. I can't do her entire bio because it would impinge on our talk. I will highlight for you her work at the intersection of policy and scholarship in science diplomacy. She is a special advisor and assembly representative to the UArctic Global Network, an elected member of the founding governing board of the International Science Council, and past chair of the U.S. National Academy's Board on International Scientific Organizations. Over the past 2 years, she has served on the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction Global Assessment Report, Advisory Board, and 15-member UNESCO Global Independence Expert Group on Universities and the 2030 Agenda. That's a little bit of a mouthful there, but those are very impressive international organizations. She is the college liaison to the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, which ARCUS, and a founding member of the UArctic Gender in Arctic Knowledge Production Thematic Network, and a partner in the UArctic Science Diplomacy Thematic Network. She also served on the state of Vermont's first Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy Committee in 2014. And last but not least, she is a fellow Dartmouth alum. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Burkins. We're really lucky to have
you. So I can't tell you, just 4 weeks on, I haven't lost my voice. I'm not contagious. We don't know what it is. It's just I don't have my normal voice. But you guys wouldn't know that. I could just pretend this is my normal voice. But it's got a little frog in the throat. That we'll see how it goes. But thank you guys for having me here. We do have a 2-hour block. That's a long time. So I love, and I'll try to look up, and if there are questions during, I have a lot of slides. When your leadership told me what you were doing, I couldn't be more excited that you guys are engaging with the Arctic and thinking about U.S. engagements with the Arctic in all different formats, because that's what I do every day. So I'm so excited to hear your thoughts. And you're probably looking at things in a very different perspective than I have, so you're going to get my perspective that I teach. And when I sit on these boards and when I try to create systems for other people to join, you're going to see my work is to think about the institutions we have. I'm a little concerned that the institutions and policies and laws we have and the ways we do things got us into a bit of a challenge right now with our future of our planet and our humans. And I'm thinking that maybe there's 2 ways. You either destroy those institutions and start again, which some folks want to do, and I get the excitement. That's like a startup, disrupt, break things. And there's the other way, which sometimes is a little more, takes care of people a little better, so that's kind of where I go, is how do you quickly, we don't have much time, but how do we move these institutions to a better place? So what you're going to hear today is, I hope, as you think about the pros and the cons of U.S. engagement in the Arctic, you're also thinking about everyone's engagement with the Arctic. You're thinking about everyone's engagement in the world, and what are the systems that make us work better together, uphold people's freedoms and rights, have a more sustainable planet, and be safe and secure, and hopefully on a more peaceful planet. So these are big idealistic things that I'm framing for you. I want all of you to I hope you'll hold idealism and aren't completely jaded yet. My husband and I, he calls me his optimism translator because he's definitely in the, not sure how we're going to get out of some of these things. But I do try to, the reason I'm optimistic, number one, you guys are engaging on this. I have Dartmouth students every day working to do their own part, whether it's in their community, in their dorm, or engaging with me in Arctic. I just have a student who's probably going to come with me to a huge Arctic Circle assembly of 6,000 Indigenous, non-Indigenous policymakers, military leaders in October. And I've been working with her, and I'm so excited she's going to engage. She's not much older than you guys are, from Nome, Alaska. So these are things I care about. So again, I'm so excited to have you here and take you on a journey of sort of what I think, but I want you guys to push at me. I ask my classes to do this. I have a perspective. I'm opinionated, but I do try. I worked, you'll see, I'll give you a little history. I worked in politics. I worked for a Democrat. I have a perspective. That said, it was a while ago and things were different then. They weren't quite as partisan. And to me, it's so important that we work together and that we understand where someone else is coming from. And I have family on different sides of political aisles, so I want those conversations. I want us to figure out how to talk with one another, because you can't do this alone. So this, I hope, again, is a journey to take you on. How do you position yourself in these debates? You're going to take different ideas, but what you're going to hear from me is a core theme that outside of this work that you're doing to learn how to debate powerfully, I'm always hoping I've infused a little new knowledge, or maybe you already have it, of how the world can work. And I think the Arctic is a bit of an example. It's in real stress right now, but there are some institutions that I think you've read about already in the Arctic that change the dynamics of how we listen to people, how we work with people, and how we try to create and center peace, security, and dialogue, peaceful and informed dialogues. So, title I gave it was, here's my opinion, Centering Arctic Indigenous Peoples in U.S. Arctic Engagement, Why Effective Arctic Policy and Security Requires Co-Leadership with Arctic Indigenous Peoples. And you heard a lot of things I'm doing. I'm going to give you a little, just because I think it's important to know who's talking to you, and it establishes credibility that I have all those things that I do. But it's actually what I also care about. And I guess I want to give a little bit of that to you just to open, and then we're going to get into more of the details. And again, ask anytime you want to. Before I get there, I forgot. I am opinionated. So I read your the resolution and the first articles you had. And I did want to clarify that a position I'm coming from, that I think your opening says, the Arctic is the final frontier, it has all these challenges. And I will actually just clarify, I don't think the Arctic is the final frontier. To me, it's a region of not only our Arctic nations, but a region of sovereign, diverse, indigenous homelands where Arctic peoples have lived for thousands of years. I know you've read some of this, but I'll just say that. Any and all U.S. Arctic engagement, you're going to hear from me, must center Alaska Native and circumpolar Arctic indigenous peoples to be effective in delivering the situational awareness and knowledge that the U.S. needs to both address Arctic and global challenges from climate change and economic development, health and welfare, biodiversity, sustainability, and the ensure security of our country. I don't think it's possible without it, or it's not as good as it should be. So we'll see if I make my case to you or not. I've never done debate, so I don't know what but I do make this is the kind of talks I give around the world, so you guys can grade me. Why do I care? I grew up here. Is anyone here from Alaska? No. Okay. Fairbanks, Alaska, in particular. This picture is when my father, he would study the aurora, and so he would go out and take, this is actually a photo he took from our front porch one night. He passed away in 2021. He was a big part of my life. But also he was colorblind. He actually couldn't see. Anyone here is colorblind. Both sons are colorblind. They can't see that this is green, just so you know. I always find that interesting that he devoted his life, the greens and the reds and the beautiful. Has anyone seen the aurora? Oh gosh, yeah. Where'd you see it?
It was like slightly visible in Washington.
Oh, cool.
A while ago.
DC or state?
State.
Yeah, that makes more sense. So if you haven't seen it, it's absolutely beautiful. I grew up with it. I always long to see it wherever I go in the Arctic. So, and it's wonderfully dynamic. And just, that's me in my yellow hat. I think I was 8, and my 2 brothers helping my father, because he did rocketry, find a rocket out in the Alaska tundra. And I gave him that t-shirt, that ugly sweater. It blinked. So it was a rocketry NASA, the Christmas sweater, and that's my brother. So this is what he did, sending rockets up into the aurora. Why I'm telling you this is because there's a bit of a history of why I'm even here. And part of that is that my dad was there for this. He'd actually been in Thule, Greenland for a year before that, learning atmospheric research in the Arctic. And then Alaska said, we need you. In Fairbanks, we're going to put this whole group together to think about the atmospheric monitoring. Does anyone know why understanding the aurora and rockets and atmosphere might be important in the 1950s, 60s? I'm about to tell you, just in case you know. Yeah. Sure.
Ozone.
Oh, ozone. I haven't heard that one. No, we didn't. I don't think we knew as much about ozone as we should have back then. But yeah, thank you. Don't be afraid. This is just when I'm asking. It doesn't have to be. But that's a good one. Not yet. But this was because of something called, you can kind of see there's Greenland over there, up in that neck of the woods is Thule way up high. Across the Canadian Arctic to Alaska, there's Fairbanks in the corner. This was the Defense Early Warning Network in the 1950s and 60s was built. We're going back to that now, by the way. Early warning because, and I'll have a little slide here, Sputnik happened. If you guys have heard about Sputnik, Russia sent us the first time, rocket went up, satellite went up, and started surveying, we could see Sputnik go by. They could, I wasn't born yet. And all of a sudden, the idea that a ballistic missile could come from Russia over the Arctic to Alaska, to the North American homelands quickly, and didn't have, it wasn't going to go all the way over the Atlantic, it was going to go right up and over. Huge panic. In fact, you'll see in one of my slides, Dartmouth was panicked. How do we train our next generation of leaders at Dartmouth about this? Everyone was panicked. My dad, there was a lot of money that went in, and so my dad was like, please come to Alaska. Meantime, my mom, they didn't last very long, but they remained friends throughout life. But that marriage only, there was 3 of us, and then that didn't work. But still, they met because her father was in the US Air Force and brought up to Alaska. So her family was brought up to Alaska. Dad was teaching physics. She took physics for a requirement. She was an artist, but it worked, at least for 3 of us. So that sparked me, just so you know, I'll go back to a few things, but that sparked the early ideas of the Aurora. This is my journey. I wanted to be, first I was gonna be a medical doctor, but I got kind of interested in the Arctic and geology as I grew up. So I worked on the Juneau ice field. Those are 2 pictures. I actually worked on the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which you guys may not know happened. It was one of the worst disasters in Alaska. And one summer, I actually went to Yale undergrad, and I worked on the RV research vessel Alpha Helix to study the oil spill. So I was kind of thinking earth science, environmental studies, medical. I wasn't sure where I was going. I did work then. I came to Dartmouth. I was just explaining to your folks. Came to Dartmouth, worked in the Antarctic Trailer Valley, which is there. And way back then, 1994, that's me, not too much older than you guys. How does climate change impact polar and global ecosystems? We were wondering about that then. I did some studies. While I was there, I'm talking to you about policy and diplomacy, and the reason I am and why U.S. engagement in a political, and you guys are doing a policy debate. I then left academia and did a fellowship and then was hired in the U.S. Senate. It's not a normal path for an academic, but I was fascinated, and I'll say it right now, I was fascinated by power, influence, and money. And I realized in the U.S., this was one place that set policies for science, for climate. I was just getting more and more interested. Maybe you guys are already there. But how does that change, research and security, and who does this stuff? So I took this fellowship. I stayed there. I worked for Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, hence why I live. You guys are in New Hampshire, but right across is Vermont. That's where I've lived many places, but Vermont I chose. And I had a portfolio that looked like this, all policy issues that maybe someday you'll be debating in some of your work, but it was energy, environment, agriculture, conservation. It was huge. It was going from studying nematodes, I'll tell you, stable isotope biogeochemistry in one place in Antarctica to that portfolio was quite a shock. And I will tell you, if any of you have ever interned on the Hill or done any political work, and how old are you?
17.
Okay, totally. It was our 17-year-old intern who helped me understand. I was a PhD. I was Dr. Burkins. I knew everything about Antarctica, Taylor Valley. I had no idea how to write a bill, how to do anything, and it was the 17, 18-year-old interns who helped me understand what I was doing. So you never know enough. You're always learning in life, and I could not have been happier that they had people who would take time to show me where to go and what to do and other folks could tell me too, but I did rely on very kind interns showing this Dr. Burkins how to actually do policy. One thing I did want to say, and this is going to be the theme here that gets us into communities and working with Arctic Indigenous peoples, is that something I learned there that I hadn't learned in my academics. I'd learned how to go do research, get money for it. But how do you listen? How and why do you listen to communities? Why would Senator Leahy's office listen to communities? Easy, they're voters. These are the folks. So our first number one every day we came in, I don't know if your colleague's internship did this, but you care about what your state's communities and your community leaders and your people think because they're your voters. And so, yes, you care about the whole of the United States. I don't know if you guys have followed, Lisa Murkowski recently voted for a bill that she said she didn't like, but she was going to try to get the best she could for her state. And she had to listen to her communities, what they needed. I moved along to UVM. I did a lot of research. I'll just say, again, all those engagements, he was working with the United Nations, all of these kinds of things I was doing as a side gig, but I was at UVM, I was trying to figure out how the knowledge that we gathered at the University of Vermont, so when I came back from DC, I left Leahy's office. I was like, the only reason, actually I loved it, my husband and I wanted to have kids and raise them in the woods. It was that simple. So we moved back up here. I taught here for a while. University of Vermont asked if they could hire me as their federal relations, moving state policy with research. And so that was my question. How does this serve the people of Vermont? Again, huge portfolio, but that's what I cared about and how I changed things. Dartmouth 2015, I come here. World's troubles are your troubles. There's nothing wrong. This is a John Sloan Dickey. He was a president of Dartmouth, and he thought Dartmouth students, all students, should be engaged in international affairs. It's what you're doing when you're involved in debate and policy. You're thinking, what's my voice mean? How does my voice make anything change? How do I learn a voice that can actually engage with people? So when I came here, it was a big switch. I really loved our house and our community in Vermont and University of Vermont. And my kids were fine. My husband loved it. He's a musician. He has gigs all the time here too, but he had gigs. And so I moved, they very kindly moved with me. Thank you. It's hard to move with them. And this is the kind of what I became the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies. And I guess I want to tell you is Dartmouth's been invested in Arctic for a very long time. Dartmouth has thought about the US engagement in the Arctic for a very, very, very long time. So I'm very honored to have taken this legacy on and helped to present where we're going to get to today. But you go way back to the 1700s. John Ledyard was one of the early Dartmouth folks, accompanied folks up to Alaska. And then you can see, actually, we had Wilhelm Stephenson. We actually have the world-renowned Stephenson collection at the Rauner Libraries here. You can go and see diaries from Indigenous leaders and others. It's fantastic. But Northern Studies program, and you see the picture, that's a picture of Sputnik. Dartmouth was very worried about the Cold War and Arctic issues and realized that its young next generation leaders needed to know about the Arctic. He said, this is the president said, the Arctic is one of the most significant growing points in the development of Dartmouth's educational program. So that goes way back. Kept going. Some of my predecessors, 89, Dr. Orrin Young. We held international conferences on the future of Arctic research. Dr. Ross Virginia is actually who I worked with in Antarctica. Became its first institute director. It worked with this John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. Dartmouth, we have an outsized reputation. It's sort of one of those punching way above your weight. You may not know Dartmouth as, no one knows, if you're here, you may not know as the Institute of Arctic Studies. Strangely enough, when we go to Arctic governments and Arctic indigenous communities, they're like, oh, Dartmouth. So, and we actually recruit heavily from Alaska Native communities. As I mentioned, we'll have someone accompanying me. And so we actually have an admissions director specifically around Alaska Native and Indigenous peoples. So Dartmouth has a history. I won't go into why, but it is a huge history here, which is very important to me. And then we've done pretty well. We've actually brought in new funds. And you'll just see some of the things. One of the ones on the list that is indigenizing Arctic research. I cannot use that term indigenizing except for the fact that I worked with three co-leaders who are Indigenous women, and they wanted that word. So I should not say I'm indigenizing Arctic research, but I have Indigenous leaders said they thought decolonization, like, no, that's like taking thing away from research. We want to actually add to it with Indigenous knowledge, so it's indigenizing Arctic research. That's a project we've been doing, and you'll see in the slides. So there's things we are doing here. And if you may not know Ambassador Brzezinski, he was actually at Dartmouth 87. But again, he was just saying Dartmouth's kind of punching above its weight on Arctic issues. So again, I feel a very strong responsibility, honor. This is my, what I grew up, you're hearing. I care about it. I grew up with this. I'm learning every day. I'm mixing all my policy diplomacy, research knowledge, academic research knowledge. But now what's the future? What are these future institutions of research? And of course, I took an oath to secure and defense of the United States when I took an oath to Congress was, this is my nation, I'm going to support it. So these are things that are very important to me. My grandfather was in the military. How does the work I do make this better for next generations, my own sons and the future, and our students here? So we inform climate solutions, but with Arctic communities. We inform Arctic policy with Arctic communities as the geopolitical tensions increase, which you guys are reading about. We think about the Arctic as a model for engaging communities. You've heard this when I said I worked for Senator Leahy, in the knowledge for global solutions and security. So this is just a core, so you know, and I inherited it from Dr. Orrin Young and Dr. Ross Virginia, my predecessors. I didn't just come at this isn't just me, but strangely enough, this is what I'm working to amplify because I think it's needed more than ever. So, if you walked out today, right now, this is my story, and you're going to see me emphasize it through some slides, which I hope are interesting. But to me, U.S. Arctic engagement, if we want the most fully informed, most effective, most situationally aware solutions that advance U.S. security, economic development, peace, to me, those solutions must be informed by knowledge and policy that is respectfully negotiated and co-created with our Arctic allies, including sovereign Arctic indigenous peoples. I just can't come up with it in New York or at Dartmouth and think I'm the smartest person in the room. I have to go out and work with the people who live there. Like I did in Leahy's office, started with communities, and I think all of us feel much more respected. If someone comes and asks our opinion of how they're gonna change our town or our lands, they don't come in and rearrange your furniture. Actually, it's like, it doesn't feel right if someone comes in and does that to your house or your room. You want someone to, if they're gonna do it for a reason, they should be talking with you and getting some pointers. So it's that simple, but that's to me the core of U.S. Arctic engagement in a place that has sovereign peoples that live there, and it's their home, and they've been there for thousands and thousands of years. So, why does it, you're hearing me say this, the Arctic is a territory and homeland. Indigenous peoples are knowledge holders with generational understandings and situational awareness of the dynamic of Arctic lands, waters, animals, and peoples. They are rights holders, not just stakeholders. It's actually, they have human rights, we'll get to that. And experienced political actors, I'm gonna show you that too, bringing critical knowledge and values to dialogue. It sounds like you've read about the Red Deal, and that's a very activist idea, which is interesting. But I'm gonna go show you that a little more, I hope, there's been actually Arctic indigenous peoples in the core basic issues of the UN and Arctic policy since the 1950s and 70s. So sometimes we forget to understand that. And they actually are the reason the Arctic Council was created, was not by nations, as it happened very much in the way it has been created and the governance of the Arctic and how we engage in the Arctic by the work, the political, very successful political activity and knowledge of Arctic indigenous leaders, mostly in the 70s and 80s of 1900. And that this proves us more resilient, more just, more sustainable policies. Okay. You guys know this. The Arctic is warming nearly 4, some people say 5, 6 times faster than the rest of the world. You actually, it sounds like you studied some issues of climate amplification, why this is happening, albedo effect, issues of dark and light, you know, the ice reflecting, less ice, it's darker, it absorbs more heat. It's a positive feedback loop that makes the Arctic, the rate of change in the Arctic happening faster. So when we're saying, oh, it's been warmer and warmer here, we see sea levels coming up, or we see landscapes changing and rivers changing and plants changing, that's happening at a rate far faster than here, or possibly where you live, in the Arctic. It's just because of how the globe works that. And what happens there then filters down, because it's kind of a thermostat for the world, the more that heats up, it accelerates our heating as well. So I'm not going to go into the physics and climate of all that. It sounds like you had a little bit of it, and you can read about that. There's also things like microbes and things coming out of the environment. We're very nervous about methane, about viruses and bacteria that have been frozen for thousands of years, and landscapes completely being lost. So things are happening now. The peoples of the Arctic are in this now. So when we're looking at, it's not like will happen later for them. Dr. Daly Sambodoro is someone I've worked with. You'll see her in a few slides. if you guys know, she was speaking at the United Nations. The Conference of Parties is called COP. We're having COP 30 coming up this November, but COP 26, she's an Inuit woman. And so to her, climate change and engagements in the Arctic, this is, again, sort of maybe similar to some of the Red Deal discussions you might have read about. The Inuit are facing an existential threat and a violation of our fundamental human right to safe and healthy human environment. So again, she was the chair of the International Inuit Circumpolar Council, which is 180,000 Inuit across Chukotka, Russia, Alaska, the north of Canada, Northwest Territories, northern Yukon, Nunavut, Greenland. It's a huge swath of 180,000 people that she represented. And Dartmouth now currently continues to work with the current chair of the ICC. And I brought her, this is what I do. I like to bring people here and learn from them. And so she talked to us about how do we empower Indigenous people. Well, she's basically saying we have a right to be in all these conversations on climate change and security. We need to be there. And she focuses on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We'll get to in a moment. So here's looking down. Maybe you've seen this before. There are about 400,000. There's about 4 million people in the Arctic. If you go above the Arctic Circle, of those 400,000 are, so a tenth are Indigenous peoples, hugely diverse. We're not talking a monolith. So when you say Arctic Indigenous peoples think X and Y, if I sound like I'm saying that, push back. It is certain leadership of certain groups in a certain, they're trying to represent, but these are really, it's just like saying, your governor or your president or speaks for everything you think. That's not true. But there are representations that have been elected. And so that's what we try to work with, but we also still try to work with communities who may be completely on a different page. So in the Arctic, there's a lot of time spent just listening and learning. And there's a tradition in the Indigenous culture about listening and learning from elders and their knowledge. So it's a much slower pace. When you want to go, because that's what we do. We're getting paper out, we're going to get this grant done. When I worked with Daly, for example, it's often like, hold on. I need to go speak with the elders. I need to go see how the different people in Alaska feel. And if we agree, 6 months later, we might move forward with you. And to understand, but if you develop that trust, now you walk together for a long ways. So Daly and I have now been working together for 3 or 4 years. But you have to take the time to develop that trust. And this is what you'll be hearing. I'm asking US engagement to do, and it was. This current administration is not doing it in the same way. I hope we can move back to a way where we build our trust with our Arctic Indigenous partners. And this administration we have people we know, and there's some colleagues of mine, I was just with one yesterday, who has bipartisan friends and is going into all offices and all executive branch folks and saying, she's briefing the Pentagon, for example. She just briefed the Pentagon on Tuesday morning and saying, this is what she's saying, work with them. This is our security, this is our power. So doesn't matter if your administration changes a bit, you keep trying to make this move forward in your policy if you believe in it. So I said I might go back, that the diplomacy in Arctic has gone for a long time. This was in 1973. I was born, you guys weren't. I was not here, but there was an Empowering Arctic Indigenous Peoples. This has been 50 years since then, was last year. A lot of these folks, Aslot Holmberg, Sarah Ulsvig she's now the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council of 180,000. About 60,000. Aslot Holmberg is the chair of the Sami Council. Anyway, these are folks who are writing these documents and saying that, this goes way back. Having Indigenous peoples at the table, thinking with them, working with them on security, diplomacy, sustainable planet, goes way back and it's both the nations, Greenland, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and the Indigenous peoples. So it's not something new that I'm saying, I'm just saying we have to double down. And our systems sometimes, our systems like to move fast. Arctic Indigenous peoples often do not want to do that, and for good reason. They want to build consensus and support, and it means it'll be much more long-lasting. But it's hard for our systems to do this. I think I don't know, does that resonate? Does anyone have a pushback on that? I don't need you to right now, just let it sit there. I find, well, especially since my growth, I was born in 1968, I'll be 57 this fall. Things happen very fast now. I could sit and read a newspaper, and it would come out once a day. I mean, you guys hear this all the time, but I love the fast pace of things. I love responding. I like getting out the social media, but there is not as much time to reflect sometimes, to understand a history that goes before, and to learn from that history and learn from those people. And I do hope that that could be part of our policy. And as we go forward, it's a little, right now with the dismantling of the State Department, those were folks that had made those relationships around the world. And it's hard for me. We're gonna move forward. I have to be optimistic. But those are the kinds of relationships that keep peace, that allow people to know each other and actually serve the US and its security, in my opinion. You may have a different one, but that's my opinion. I think it's an important opinion, but it's an opinion. So here's more. Caleb Pungawi, I just met his granddaughters who still do this work. He was back in those 70s, he was a leader and had negotiated the full access of Arctic Indigenous peoples at the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, which became the Arctic Council. Mary Simon, I almost was on a panel with her and there's a meeting coming up, and I was so excited. She can't make it, but oh my gosh, she's one of my heroes. She served as the first Inuk. Inuk means an Inuit indigenous woman, indigenous person. Inuk is not male or female. She was the first Inuk to hold an ambassadorial position for Canada, and she was the Canadian ambassador of Circumpolar Affairs back in the 90s and 2000s. And she actually, when I say the Arctic Council wouldn't exist, she was there, and when they decided, we're not sure who are Arctic Indigenous people is part of this, she'd already gotten the news people outside, because they sort of said they would, but it was going to be a betrayal. She got them outside, and she said, fine, I'm going to go out and have my press conference. Like, oh, no, Mary, stay. And for her and for the other two, the Inuit Circumpolar Council and two other early Arctic Indigenous peoples, that kind of being there, knowing your politics, knowing when to grandstand, knowing the threats you could make, allowed the Arctic Council to have Arctic Indigenous peoples as permanent observers, permanent participants, which you don't see many places. If you guys have read about we're going to talk a little bit about it, but the Arctic Council, which thinks about the governance of at least the environmental protection and sustainability and humans of the Arctic, the reason it has Arctic Indigenous peoples can veto anything. They have a very powerful voice, so it's co-equal in many ways. That is only because of Mary Simon. So again, I kind of fangirl her just a little bit. I have seen her and met her, but I haven't sat in a panel with her. So if you guys have I think I saw, did they have a reading of the Arctic Council? Okay, so I won't go into that. Level set, that it's the leading intergovernmental forum, cooperation, coordination, interaction, Arctic Indigenous peoples, other Arctic inhabitants, established in 1996. How it works to know is, to me, so interesting. If you guys do Model UN, I actually run a Model Arctic Council, very different than Model UN. Does anyone do Model UN yet? Somehow I thought this group might be. So Model Arctic Council is a little different because we don't just do whoever gets the votes wins. We follow the Arctic Council, and also very much by the Indigenous co-creators of the Arctic Council, that they have to have consensus negotiation. You have to find somewhere. Now, this is because whatever comes out of the Arctic Council has to have everyone agree, or it does not come out. Decisions must be co-created. The Indigenous people don't have a vote, if you remember this, but they have the veto power. So they are at the table, and if they don't have consensus, it's done. That's power. That's huge power. There's a possibility of votes in the future, but again, they're not set up like sovereign or like Western democracies or other Arctic nations with governments and parliaments. That's not how the sovereign Indigenous peoples' organizations are, but consensus is how that worked forward. So co-created solutions with Arctic Indigenous peoples through its working groups, through its ministerials, and consensus, and that's not normal. In most, to me, when I told you I like to find institutions and platforms that are sort of saying, we got into this world in one way, how do we maybe make it better? I looked, and I could be wrong, but I looked to this idea of having governance structures that take more of the community inhabitant perspective, which actually I think the US democracy is about. It's our House of Representatives, that's our senators. Take that perspective and try to make sure it is part of our decision making. So to me, this was really important. You shouldn't just have the Arctic nations thinking about the future of the Arctic. You need the people who live there, who have lived there for thousands and thousands of years. It's the Arctic indigenous people. So the UN does not have that. It has an Indigenous Peoples Forum that sits on the side, but they are not at the Security Council. They are not in the economic councils unless they're invited, right? Different status. So of those permanent participants, which you learned about, Aleut International Association, Arctic Athabascan Council, Gwich'in Council, Inuit Circumpolar Council, Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, Ripon, Sami Council. These are the leadership with whom Dartmouth tries to work, and then work also with communities in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, as we move forward. And of course, we also work very closely with the governments of the Arctic nations, and those are the big 8 with land. So the US, as you know, is only an Arctic nation because of Alaska, because otherwise it doesn't have territory yet.
Would you say the relationships with the Ripon of the Russian Association, is that still, does it vary depending on administrations and politics?
So it's such a good question. I didn't go into this, but I'll give it a really short answer. Is yes, Ripon and the Russian. When we did the pause, which is a slide, we may never get there, but when we did the pause after the war in Ukraine, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the Arctic nations and Arctic indigenous peoples said we're not going to work with Russia or Ripon. Now, the reason, usually Ripon would be Aleut International does not speak for the US. They have US, they actually work out of Anchorage often. Gwich'in Council works out of the Yukon and Alaska, also has places in Canada. Ripon had been, or tried to be, an independent agent of Russia, the Russian government. A guy named Pavel Suzandiga, who Dartmouth actually helped him escape with his life in 2017 because he had been working with Putin and Putin didn't like him anymore. And so he and his family fled here, and Dartmouth actually helped him. He's now living in Maine, and he's part of a huge resistance to Ripon, thinking that Ripon is no longer its own independent voice. It now speaks with the Russian government. Okay. So I talked to Pavel a lot, I learned a lot from him. But as we've tried to normalize since the war, it's hard to have the Arctic Council not working. We've been trying to slowly rebuild it and build trust and see where we can work with. We haven't been able to work with Russia ministerials yet, but we did have the leadership, or quietly there was some leadership of Ripon, did meet with the indigenous peoples in Norway. Norway was the chair for the last 2 years. That did happen. That was controversial, but it was kept quiet. So Ripon, whether you think it is the Kremlin, Putin, or not, it has been in some higher level political meetings. Right now, and I have a slide that you may know, the Arctic Council went on pause for like 2 years. Slowly, when Norway became the chair, because Russia was the chair, no one went. We paused. But when Norway became the chair, which was wonderful that Russia handed it off in a virtual, but it still happened, the 2-year Norwegian chairship that's just ended in May, they actually tried to do this. And so that is how Ripon is now. We can talk about how there's actually there's spies and everything else happening. It's all happening. We're all very aware. But anyway, that's what's going on right now. And the working groups, you may know at the Arctic Council, non-political, the working groups, the experts, the indigenous people, knowledge holders, they're all coming together, and they can write to each other and work on videos. They can't transfer money, but they can give their recommendations up to the political decision makers at the Arctic Council. But we still are not having meetings of all Russian 8 nations. So that still hasn't happened.
Who informs the decisions of the working groups?
Who informs them?
Yeah.
So there's delegates, they kind of, so all the 6 working groups, the Sustainable Working Group, Arctic Marine Monitoring, Advanced Assessment Program, there's one on emergency preparedness for shipping. So those are all the Arctic Council like to have members in them, but they often have someone who chairs it from a country, sometimes the chairship, sometimes another country. And then they actually can go out and they can tap me. They can tap experts. They kind of try to get a small group that's representative, and those working groups work on specific projects that the Arctic Council says, okay, these are important projects. Or they have proposals they want to bring to the level of the political folks. And then all the money, the Arctic Council has no money, but it has to bring in money from those side gigs. So does that kind of help?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to say again, I'm giving a little Dartmouth plug if you guys want to come here. You like this stuff. we actually have been working in Greenland and sending students to study climate change politics. We actually don't do security in this particular program, but climate change, politics, community engagement. We've been working with high schools and our undergrads and our graduates called the Joint Science Education Project. The only challenge, of course, is NSF funded. That National Science Foundation has been slashed quite a bit, and this is hanging on by a bit of a thread. This was work we did in our Thayer School of Engineering, co-producing with Toku Oshima, Lena Colson Holm from Greenland, and the small community of Kanak up near Thule, Greenland, on energy transitions in their 600 people community. It was a co-developed with the community, submitted again to NSF, got $2.6 million. But this is, we try to, and it got an award. What I'm saying is we try to practice what we preach. I talk about all this. It's not easy, but we do try to actually work. Not all of faculty at Dartmouth do this, but in our Institute of Arctic Studies, the projects we take on and bring Dartmouth faculty, we try to emphasize these values. And not only that, when we do research, when we do policy papers, we try to have them translated into the language of the peoples that are affected. So this research will be translated into Greenlandic or Kalaalleq, I say it wrong, Kalaalleq. This is the work I mentioned before, Indigenizing Arctic Research. There's Daly, who you saw before, Dr. Daly Sambodoro. Varvara Korkina Williams was actually Russian Indigenous. I had her as a fellow for 3 years. Tatjana Degay is also from Russia, from Chukotka, but works now at the University of Victoria in Canada. And these are the three of us non-Indigenous folk who were part of this work. And what we were trying to do was bring this co-production, this waiting for working, making sure we fund Indigenous knowledge holders in our research. We don't just do it the same old way. We just don't do it the same old way. And that was what this research was about. And I think I've got some slides yet of how far we come. Let me jump forward. All of this is based on what are the policy issues, and these are the things I think you guys can be debating with. This is a big guy. If you haven't come across it before, when you're working in the Arctic and with Arctic Indigenous peoples, and it is actually a protocol of U.S. engagement with the Arctic, which is part of our current defense strategy. It may change, but right now it's part of our defense strategy, it's part of our Arctic strategy from at least the Biden administration, is to work with Arctic Indigenous peoples and Alaska Native peoples. That's in the policy. If you haven't seen them, you'll see the documents in just a minute. But this idea that this underpins it is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which says they need free, prior, and informed consent, and they need to be involved in the process and decision-making. Is it implemented? No. This is the core piece for Arctic Indigenous people say, we got this. The UN said, and you just signed on to this. Now implement it, because it's really hard to implement. That means you have to go and talk with the community before anything happens and get their free, prior, and informed consent. And let me go back, it's a silly analogy, but someone coming in and rearranging your living room, someone coming in and giving you a vaccine. You want free, prior, and informed consent. That is our right. And that's what the Indigenous people are saying, that's our right. You don't just get to come in and do a test on our waters or change our healthcare system because you think it's that. We have to be involved in that. It seems very obvious, but it's not often done. Not done in the way it always should be. Because we run by nations and governments and parliaments, and that's where policy happens, and there's not in many places do you actually also have the Indigenous sovereign peoples having a place at the table. So these are too small for you to see. What I will tell you is this started the growing anger that and frustration that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the free, prior, and informed consent was not being used by the US at least, and the international community had a very strongly worded letter, but it's actually more than that. Very angry, the Inuit said, look, the Arctic we want has us connected. The UN says, you can see the UN, I don't know if you see it, the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous People applies to our entire homeland, including lands, waters, ice, space, and resources. Uphold it. Canada has a national Inuit strategy on research. It's not connected to the Canadian, they said, we're going to do our own. And guess what it does? It says, you will work with Indigenous peoples on our lands. You will not work here without our permission or with our knowledge holders. You will not do that, or basically, we will not let you in. This was called the Kawarek letter in Alaska. It went to the U.S. National Science Foundation in 2020. And it said, I know you guys are trying, but you keep coming into Alaska, doing research on us without us, like we're lab rats, cut it out. So this letter went to the National Science Foundation, again said, we are going to tell the senators, we're going to tell everyone, no more Arctic research in Alaska, we're done with you. It was very powerful, it was pretty angry, and it showed, if you look these papers up, they're out there, I cite them all the time, it's a very powerful story. The Sami also, who live in Finland and Norway and Russia, wrote in 2021, ethical guidelines for research involving the Sami, same principles, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, and then lots of issues about the Sami ways of knowing. And then this is the ICC, wrote the Equitable and Ethical Engagement. This is a very powerful document. It's required reading. I hope if you take one, you'll read, and I'm going to summarize it for you. This is a really important document. It covers from climate studies to policy to security. This is a document that centers a lot of what Indigenous peoples are asking for to be co-leading and giving the information we need for a better world. But they said, on our terms, you don't just get to come in and ask us and take our knowledge and then go off and do whatever you're going to do. We get to walk with you. Make time to trust us. Make time for us to trust you, more importantly. Make time to earn our knowledge, pay for our knowledge, and then we can co-publish together, and that's how we will come out with a more secure, situationally aware world. But you don't just come in and extract our knowledge and then go. So that's what this document is. And again, this is the EU. There's a comprehensive policy roadmap to decolonial Arctic research. And this is from the Sami, but also some Inuit, Arctic research upholding Indigenous people's rights. So I guess I'm showing you these are constant documents coming out. This is so important in the research knowledge space, and I'll show you now. It's also in, I can't remember where my slides are. It's also in the security space. So just what is this? I said it was really important. What are these protocols? It's very simple, nothing about us without us. We had a very powerful moment in March at a huge, 2,000 people research conference. Norma Shorty from Alaska, we all tear up still. It was a very powerful statement about nothing about us without us, as about 40 people were on stage holding a big banner saying nothing about us without us. So how do we co-design questions with communities? That's that word again. How do we recognize Indigenous knowledge, which is place-based, which is generational, which is working with the land, and respect it as a diverse way of knowing? So it's not just the Western scientific method, but how do we engage with people who have different ways of expressing knowledge and information? How do we commit to that knowledge co-production? How do we share the knowledge, make sure it's in a language or forms that are accessible by a community in the rural north? So it's not just a paper in a journal. How do we uphold the rights to self-determination in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the free, prior, and informed consent? How do we respect languages, histories, and cultures? These aren't people just plopped. You have to actually take time to learn. I'm still learning. I'm making so many mistakes, and they tell me. But they know I'm coming back, so I haven't been cast out. I have been asked to get off webinars because I wasn't trusted yet, and I do. But then, so far, I'm coming back on webinars when I can, but it's a long time. People don't automatically trust you, especially if you are an academic who has worked in government. And I won't say this is just Arctic Indigenous peoples right now. It's actually Canadians and Finnish folks. It's a little bit challenging right now. But we've developed trusted relationships, and we want to maintain them. That's really important for us, that we do what we say, that our first goal is to support Arctic peoples, Arctic nations, and Arctic Indigenous peoples. The first thing isn't just for me to get a Dartmouth paper or my own next step in my job. You guys know this already. You can read that in somebody pretty quick. Am I really there to try to work and find solutions together as long as they may take? And I'm very lucky that Dartmouth's very privileged, has resources for me to go there and be somewhere for a week. Not everyone has that ability, but that's what I consider very important. Exercise accountability, I just said this, build trust. And then fund. If I go and ask an Indigenous person or community for knowledge, what am I giving back? I can't, that's just, I get paid to do this. How, for me to go in and get information from local knowledge holders on fishing, they need to have some funding. So when I write a grant to a philanthropist or a federal grant, if I'm doing US engagement in the Arctic, have I thought that that engagement may cost money. It does on a business. We know business, it costs money. Well, how come going and working with what I think is valuable information, but you can just go get for free? The folks are saying that's not acceptable. So, some principles to think about. Our U.S. Arctic Research Plan for the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee and the U.S. National Science and Technology Council in 2021 had an Arctic research plan that said, first paragraph, climate change, dynamic change, thawing of permafrost, wreaking havoc, loss of ice, water's gone, dwellings collapsing, eroding shorelines. But they required integrated knowledge-based actions. Science and indigenous knowledge would be key to effectively addressing these complex issues. Okay, so this is the federal government of the US, at least in the last administration, saying how important this was in its five-year research plan. This was from the last administration in 2022. I don't know if I was so amazed when this came through. They actually required all federal, I don't know if you guys know this, all federal agencies under the Biden administration had to incorporate indigenous knowledge. I was just like, whoa, that snuck in there. But it was very powerful. And a lot of agencies were now being dismantled, but we're trying to do this. And it took a lot of new resources, new people. They were hiring indigenous boundary spanners. There was a lot, as we call them, knowledge spanners. But we had 3 years of it. This is the International Arctic Science Committee. I just had the vice president here with the woman who was briefing the Pentagon, who's part of my team, part-time of my team. Also this guy was the vice president of this. The International Arctic Science Committee is huge for the future. U.S. is a member of this. U.S. pays a lot of dues to be part of this, to have knowledge for the future of our planet in the Arctic. And you can see, again, policy-wise in the international research policy space, they are very clear, this is in 2022, that they are committed to recognizing that traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and Western scientific knowledge are co-equal and complementary knowledge systems that can and should inform the work. That ICART 4 thing is what I was talking about, indigenizing Arctic research. This is a 10-year research plan that we're working on, getting indigenous peoples to have a voice, so it's not just Western. I wanted, oh yeah.
What's the difference between indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge?
Such a good question. And sadly, as a non-indigenous person, there's some arguments. There's even a word about indigenous science. So a lot of the framing, what they were trying to do is cover all bases. Some folks' traditional and ecological knowledge is less indigenous. It could be local. So local communities might have traditions that are knowledge systems that are really important to know. Like, why did they do that? But they weren't indigenous. Or they're based in ecology and ecosystems, so that's sort of the traditional and ecological knowledge. It may not be indigenous. Indigenous knowledge systems, there's the indigenous peoples who talk about them, and I've been in, with leadership. It's really, you have to be indigenous because it's really about how you were raised and sitting with elders and learning from the stories. So it's a little broader than traditionally. It does include some ideas of spirituality, some call it, but that means we're all connected. There's a very strong power that I actually heard a guy corrected in a meeting recently when he said, well, but the rocks, I understand being connected to trees and lands, but the rock. She's like, no, I consider myself not only connected to you, but to the rock, to all of space, to all, that is in indigenous knowledge systems. It's the butterfly effect is everywhere. We are all connected. It is not living, non-living. Everything is how we have to, that's only take what you need. There's a few ideas, but it is hard, but indigenous knowledge is really for indigenous people, and it can span into the other knowledge systems, if that helps. Not easy, though. I wanted to go and say, step back a bit and say, I've been focusing on indigenous knowledge, but you saw that community engagement was so important in the policy for Vermont for me, and I think it brings better knowledge, just communities. So this actually goes to the traditional ecological knowledge. Local knowledge systems, different than indigenous knowledge, but there's an overlap because you're talking about local place-based knowledge that goes back generations. Even the IPCC said, we can't get there from here unless we work with communities. We need climate resilient development. The only way we actually figure this out, we can't just make things happen in Geneva and New York. We have to get diverse values, worldviews, and knowledges, including scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and there's your answer, local knowledge, into this mix. So even the big IPCC at the UN said this. This is a graduate of Dartmouth who works at the World Bank, part of the UN. How do you fund these things? He says, we're not going to get there if we don't engage communities and have them involved in decision making. If the communities aren't bought in, we can make all the net zero discussions we want, and they're going to keep doing what they're doing if we're not out there working with people on the ground. And again, this goes back to what I learned in the Leahy office that was so important. This is Indigenous values. This came out of the Biden administration, Indigenous values and clean energy transitions in Alaska. Another Dartmouth alum, Alexandra Salmon, and a leader. She's the village president of Ikiaki, Alaska. And you can hear this, again, sort of how this works, that locally driven solutions are the only ones that will be sustainable. And she goes further as an Indigenous woman, says they draw upon our ancient lived wisdom in place. We can use that rooted in our Indigenous values and value systems to come up with a self-determined solution to the challenges we face. She wants to work with the U.S. Department of Energy. She wants energy transitions in her village of Ikiaki. She's a Dartmouth-trained woman. She's powerful. She comes back here and gives us advice all the time. She works with students. And she says, respect us, respect what we know. Don't do this without us. So I mentioned that, I won't go too into this. There's a 10-year Arctic research planning process. The work, the first one was actually held here. This is actually a full flyer in 1995. We didn't have websites, we had flyers. This was actually at Dartmouth. I inherited this work because on this list is Caleb Pungawi, you saw early, Mary Simon and Caleb Pungawi, those two Indigenous folks that worked in the 1970s to create the Arctic Council and make sure Indigenous voices were there. The first establishing director at Dartmouth, Orrin Young, made sure they were part of this, along with Russia and Finland and everybody. So Dartmouth has a history here. You saw that. I won't go for it. This is the kind of folks that show up when we talk about this. Overseas. I just want to show the diversity. We have military who show up. We have Indigenous folks who show up. We have heads of state who show up in a packed room to talk about how we do this because it's hard to do. It's not easy. We're still learning how to implement those ethical, equitable protocols. They're not the systems we currently have. So this was Arctic Circle tweeted this out that indigenizing Arctic research, it creates spaces where Arctic Indigenous peoples define the terms of research, establishing real respectful balance between Western science and Indigenous knowledge. So I guess showing you it's not just here at Dartmouth. These are bigger ideas that are moving and shaping the institutions of the future, I think, and I hope the US continues to embrace them, even if there's a little bit of a backstep right now. That work we did with indigenizing Arctic research, or we have been doing, is about to close. It was a 2-year grant. That woman, Daly, you saw, Dr. Daly Sambodoro Inuit. This is her being announced. This is the ICARP, it's a terrible acronym, International Conference on Arctic Research Planning. It's the decadal research planning for the world of the Arctic. So big meetings in Scotland and Copenhagen. It was all, Henry Burgess was the chair. He stepped aside, he said, guess what, I can't do this without Daly. So it was the first time we actually had an Arctic Indigenous co-chair, and that was just our grant helped make this happen. So we're very proud of that. She also created the first Arctic Indigenous Peoples Coordinating Group to advise her as she was part of this. There's a lot of money involved here. I'm going to say money and power. It sounds weird, but who gets to say what research is moving forward as a priority? Some of these groups are doing that for governments around the world, and she's now involved. So we're thinking, this is my ask right now is, can we do this? Can the stuff we've done with this International Conference on Arctic Research Planning, something I'm looking at in 2032-33 is something called the International Polar Year, where all governments around the world think about how we invest and engage in the poles, Antarctica, Arctic. We want to make sure that this Arctic Indigenous peoples, and to be honest, there's actually there's no peoples in Antarctica, but New Zealand Maori, Indigenous peoples of Tasmania, Indigenous peoples of Latin America. The oceans around Antarctica are also their territories. So how do you engage these systems even as we think about the future of the international polar world? So we're working on this right now. Last but not least, I work on the board of this International Science Council. I just stepped down after 2 terms. I was a governing member. I'm still a fellow. This is me at the United Nations. So we mentioned I do this kind of thing. But what am I talking about there? I'm talking about this. I'm talking about the importance of working with Indigenous peoples and telling the UN, you guys got this side event. How do you bring Indigenous peoples more into the core of if this is on sustainability, it was a sustainability summit. How do you bring that? I was sort of asking that question. You can see me online, probably not very, I was doing my best, but it was my first time at the UN. It was pretty cool. So, but when I have this, you're hearing, when I have this something to say, I try to talk about it in multiple places, get pushback, get feedback, and shape my knowledge accordingly. So this was on catalyzing transformative change, enhancing the science policy interface. I was talking about this. This is something I worked on for the International Science Council. Again, how do we do science differently? Oh, look, co-creating actionable knowledge identified by local and global stakeholders, research and action with inclusive collaboration, a wide array of stakeholders making the new norm. So the idea that we have to expand the folks with whom we work to get the best knowledge to save our planet. And I said this is a security too. This was the national strategy that came out in October of 2022 for the US engagement in the Arctic. First and foremost, of course, if any of you guys are security buffs, actually, as you hear, I have it in my history. I care deeply about our security. First and foremost, of course, we're going to protect the homeland. That's the Defense Department's job. That's the job of the Commander-in-Chief. That's the job of government, is to protect us. But I will also say, and one of the ways to do that was emphasized in this national strategy for the Arctic region in 2022 was support an equitable partnership, integrating co-production knowledge with indigenous knowledge into the federal processes, which they did, and supporting tribal self-determination. So again, these are not just sort of red deal ideas. These are things that have actually been put into policy and right now have to be repealed if they're going to be repealed, or perhaps we've done enough to make this sort of locked into US policy. Maybe you guys will learn more about, or will know more about that than I do by the end of your work. So, I keep saying this is really important work and it does better. I just wanted to give you some examples. Arctic Council, you already heard about. Programs like exchange of local observations, navigating the community office, work in the Arctic. You'll just see a few of these. There's the Arctic Council, as I said. The indigenous peoples have a voice at the table. They're around that major circle. They have advisors. That's cool. That's information we need to actually work sustainably in the Arctic. ILOCA is this exchange for local observation knowledge of the Arctic. This isn't, we have satellites, we have ground things, we have lots of different things to sense temperatures and stuff. Sea ice movement. What if we also tap into indigenous folks in indigenous knowledge communities who can write up on their phone and add to, with indigenous, their vision, their knowledge of systems. My grandfather always said the berries were out this time of year. They're not. Yes, you can get something from a sensor in the soil. You're also going to get something from the narratives of the people who live there and who have the stories of their grandfathers and their grandfathers. And as you put all that together, you get a narrative. We actually have people now, a woman who works with the woman I mentioned briefing in the Defense Department. She's actually a Army veteran. She's an indigenous woman, and she's a machine learning specialist, and she's learning how to get AI to understand indigenous knowledge for sea ice predictions in Alaska. That's her. She actually has a company called Polar Arctic. She's won all sorts of awards. I would like to get her here to speak at Dartmouth. But this idea that this is about security, this is about bringing these knowledge systems together. And how do you do it? It's hard. It's not easy, because our machine learning systems are usually based on everything that's been written. Have the indigenous knowledge been written down? That's not really its form. So how do you get these kinds of systems into our AI? And people are trying to think about that. There's actually indigenous coalitions for AI starting up. Navigating the New Arctic. This community office, the person who was here, who is the vice president of International Arctic Science Committee and International Science, Dr. Matt Druckenmiller, who was just here this week. He's the lead of this with Nupush Carlo, who's actually on the White House Arctic Research Commission. She's a commissioner for the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. She herself is also indigenous. And she's a neuroscientist who's an indigenous knowledge holder. And the two of them run this with the idea is all U.S. research should go through and learn, and this connects U.S. researchers with Alaskan indigenous communities. And what they do is this idea that you have indigenous advisory boards and Western science advisory boards. So they tried to create a system of how you put all these knowledge systems together to make better knowledge. Remember all those letters where they're saying, not about us, without us, stop it? This was I tried, it's not perfect, but one of the answers was, okay, let's create a system where we can't do research in Alaska unless you go through and bring in and have indigenous folks look at your knowledge, your research first. Central Arctic Oceans, this is a huge international agreement. The Inuit Circumpolar Council that I mentioned is powerful, 180,000 Inuit. They've been very, very clear that anything to do with the UN international that has to do with Arctic, they need to be at the table, because yes, they're at the table in the Arctic Council, but what about all these other treaties and resolutions? So Sarah Alsvig, who's currently the chair, she's about to step down, she's just getting her PhD, she's amazing. But the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement just came into effect, protecting unregulated fishing in the Arctic. Fishing is a huge economic and survival livelihood for indigenous peoples in the Arctic. You probably all know, you look at all the water, and that's where people get their food. So the Inuit Circumpolar Council did not ask. They made themselves, we will be at the table and you will take us seriously to understand how we make United Nations treaties about this space. And it was very powerful. I'm going to hold a webinar. My colleague is putting together a webinar with the State Department right now to showcase. I'm happy to send you guys the date and time. It's going to be in August with some of the leaders who negotiated this agreement, Inuit knowledge holders, and why that was important. And this also led to the Inuit now becoming a permanent status at the international IMO, the International Maritime Organization. So again, indigenous peoples of the Arctic are politically savvy and they are powerful, and they are making sure that in the past IMO was like, certain countries and the UN countries. They're saying, no, we're there too. Not about us, without us. We want it, and they have been made a permanent member. So these are the kind of shifts in systems that I would love the US to support, because it's better for all of us. So when you don't do it, you get, as you've heard from me, I think you get knowledge gaps in our diplomacy and our security, and our situational awareness of what's going on in the Arctic is compromised. You don't want that. We want the best information, sort of like when we left women out of policy. Remember that? You guys are too young. But there was a time when women couldn't hold, and there's still places women can't hold property, they can't vote, they can't bring their knowledge, and or I'm sure people of different backgrounds. So it's important that we all support these ideas of us getting the best knowledge from all the people with all the backgrounds possible. You're hearing, this is my opinion. It's not being tamped down at all for you guys. The harm, we create distrust and amplify the potential, for failure, for climate action and security, because we lose allies, and the U.S. commitment to democratic principles, equality, and that bottom-up, community-centered power in human governance versus top-down autocracy, oligarchy, monarchy, which I don't think benefit us. I think it's people coming in and rearranging our furniture and giving us things we don't want without our consent. So I think it's important to keep this idea, what I think our democracy is based on. You have elected governments who have power, they're supposed to represent you, and they are powerful, not a single person, not a single entity. This is why the United States is hard. Democracy is an experiment, but I do think it's totally flawed, it's slow, it's maybe not up to some of the quick changes today, but the alternative of a top-down, someone making decisions for us who has a lot of money and power, that's not, for me at least, that's not an option. So I'm going to keep fighting for this. I've worked with, I also think money, you've heard money. I made a project with Citibank and their environmental social governance, if any of you are interested in finance. They were interested in green energy transitions, but I said, guess what, you don't get to make a project and go, I'll take you there only if you sit and listen for 14 days. They were not allowed to talk about projects. They were not allowed to design their own thing to come in. This was the idea, how do I set up a co-development potential? I introduce, let them talk and share knowledge with Greenlandic government, business, community organizations, Inuit organizations, and they did it, and it was really fun. The leader for their sustainability happens to be a Dartmouth alumna, Bridget Fawcett, and so she took the lead with trying to do it. It was a really, the Council on Foreign Relations right now has a business group going up. They're also checking in with Dartmouth of how to have respectful engagements in the Arctic. Another thing, there's an Arctic investment protocol for finance that actually says it's not perfect. It was done by a bunch of global business leaders in oil and gas and everyone else, but that's okay. You need them there too. But they did discuss this was in 2022, I think, that investments, US investments, all investments in the Arctic, all those principles I was talking about, co-develop, take time, invest back in communities, be sure that the communities, it's not just an extraction, you're actually working with the community to have a deal that invests back in the Arctic. That's the principles of the Arctic Investment Protocol. That you are not allowed to just go in and take the rare earth minerals. That negotiation has to involve something for the community to build, and let's say get Greenland independence. There has to be a respect of what the peoples of the Arctic want. I already gave you that one. Sorry, it just repeated. I wanted to say Canada has a framework that's very similar, that they say they're going to include Indigenous communities. This actually happens in Finland. The Sami people will tell you it's not quite as implemented, but again, this idea that we're all thinking of our security and our future economic development. Countries that have thought about this have made declarations. As the U.S. rethinks its engagement in the Arctic, I hope and Canada, I hope these stay strong. And I mentioned the challenges of the Arctic Council. There was a pause, limited re-engagement. What someone mentioned, the working groups have resumed, but just dialogues. And now the Arctic Council, this is kind of big, the Arctic Council chairship for the future of U.S. engages in the Arctic through the Arctic Council. The future of this engagement is now in the hands of the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland. And we have not necessarily treated Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark as they would like to have been treated in the last few months. But they are the chair. They hold the power right now. And so that's important to think about. And that's why Dartmouth's trying to think about how our engagements in Greenland, how do we make sure they continue? We actually have a partnership with Ilisimatasarfik, which is the University of Greenland. So these are partnerships and connections. Regardless of what's going on politically, at Dartmouth, we're trying to maintain these relationships of trust and how can we work together. I hold these kinds of things. This is me in Tromsø, Norway. How do we think about Arctic cooperation at a time of geopolitical tensions? This one I did at Dartmouth. This one was in Tromsø, and I did get a question. We actually talked about things, and a good friend of mine from Finland came and said, Melody, you're talking about all these geopolitical tensions, but I have to say, I think it's lame. There were like 10 times you guys in this room. So I'm not, and she called me out, she said it's lame. She said, what's going on with this new administration? Because immediately there was threats of Greenland takeover, all of those things. And I was there, so I was there right when this was happening. So I did, you might guess, I said my piece. I was very strong about it. And I did say that I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I thought it was going to get worse. Unfortunately, before it got better, we would try to make it better and try to maintain our allies, but I thought it was in the U.S. interest to do so. But I also said it was really time for the Canada, the EU, the Nordics, and Greenland to come together and have a voice on the Arctic that retained the values that we've all been talking about, because I wasn't sure the U.S. or Russia was going to be holding them. So if U.S. and Russia aren't holding those values of respectful engagement for the global security and peace, then maybe those groups would do it. So that's what I said in public. These are the Inuit. Just so you remember, this started a long time ago. We're revisiting it. I think we can do it better. I think the U.S. can do this defense of our homeland, working with our allies. But like we didn't do it great. We actually displaced a lot of Indigenous communities when we did this in the 50s. But how do we do this in a way that's actually respectful? I think it makes us safer. I think it makes us better. And I think he said it, Nate Nobad, the president of the National Inuit Organization, said, yes, we got infrastructure because of that militarization. At the same time, it wasn't really community building. So he's basically saying, how can these new northern warning systems, these new investments in defense of our North American Arctic homeland, all of ours, how can it include Indigenous peoples and be better? Not displace people, but engage them, build allies with all of in situational awareness. And that's, I'll go to this, go to Greenland. A lot of the work we do is to repeat to the U.S. right now, to repeat to U.S. at the Pentagon, in legislators. We say, listen to Greenland, listen to our allies in Greenland. Greenland is for Greenlandic people. They don't want to be Danish, they don't want to be American, they want to be Greenlandic. But they say, we want to work with you, we want to be your friends, we want to work with you on security. We want business. We're open for business, we're not for sale. So this is the kind of thing that Dartmouth and other folks who believe in maybe an inclusive Arctic where we do things together, these are the kinds of things we're working on now. I'm doing it through research, doing it in the security space, we're doing it in the policy and diplomacy space. And I don't think it's opinion, I think it's us trying to get better knowledge for the future of our planet. If you have different opinions, you are absolutely allowed to do them. The basics you saw before. If you had to walk away, this is what I believe in, that our knowledge and policy has to be respectfully co-created for it to be informed, effective, situationally aware, and give us security and economic development. There's been some ends of that. We've lost some incredible federal, powerful places that brought, another reason that Dartmouth's stepping up, there's been a lot of places we used to work with and let them do it. They're gone. That's that part. Wilson Center Polar Initiative is gone. That was a huge, powerful voice in the U.S., in Washington, making these engagements with Arctic Indigenous peoples and embassies in Washington for the Arctic. The U.S. Ambassador, Mike Sprague, he was on our strategy call on Tuesday. He's no longer, he was appointed by Biden, so he's no longer the ambassador. We don't have an ambassador now. But he was head of the Wilson Center before he was ambassador. ARCUS is about to fold, his NSF funding is gone. That kept us all, there was a calendar of events, it kept us all informed. NSF polar programs looks like it's being shut down and dismantled and put in different places. This is the funding that helps us do a lot of what did help us. That program we have in Greenland, indigenizing Arctic research, we're funded through this, so we have to find other funders. The U.S. Global Research Change Program that thought about Arctic science, the NOAA Arctic report card, annual report card of the situation of climate change. All of these are right now either about to be gone, or we're trying to figure out where the data sets can go to be safe when the U.S. government no longer supports them. So, recommendations and my closing for U.S. engagement, you've heard them all. If you want, is that we follow the Arctic Indigenous peoples' call for their engagement, respect UN Declaration of Respect of Rights of Indigenous People. We invest in Indigenous-led institutions and leadership. We ensure the representation of Indigenous people's sovereignty and co-leadership in our policies and our security. We know that this is not just a legal and a nice thing to do, it actually makes us more effective, and I think it'll save a lot American lives and stabilize our U.S. investments. That we support the co-leadership and co-creation of this so that we have situational awareness and knowledge to address our complex challenges and to ensure our security. That is, I have an opinion. You've heard it. Thank you.
If we were to go about looking for arguments like that, where do you think the best way that we could, find research or papers on that would be?
So a lot of it's coming out. I think what I can do, I'll give a copy of these slides. A lot of those, pulled out words. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're there. And so some of the strategies, the international strategies. But I have a paper I'll give you guys too on rethinking Arctic science diplomacy that elevates this. So I think there's a few of us trying to work, and maybe people I cite or some of these others cite. If you guys know how that fun research way that you read a paper and then you see everyone they cite. But some of the ones that I've posted here, and then some others I can give to your leadership, and you guys get to do the deep dives. Yeah.
Can you give examples of when Indigenous knowledge has provided has helped create more effective policies?
Yeah, so the Central Arctic Ocean, I didn't go into it, but the ways that language now, first of all, respects Indigenous knowledge, but also, for example, it comes up a lot in fisheries, that people will go up and count the fish. This is how many fish, oh my gosh, there's a decline. And a lot of the Indigenous people, no, they just moved. They're coming back in 2 years. This is the natural progression of how this fishery moves. So don't put a moratorium yet, because we need these. So these are the kinds of sort of nuances of policy where often numbers, data, quick data we get in like 2 or 3 years when we do Western observing research, which is very good. But we put in sensors and we look for a year, we look for 2 years. Sometimes we do long term, but often we'll do just like 1 or 2 years, and then we'll use that evidence-based information for policy. When you work with Indigenous peoples who have the stories, the ideas, the kind of understanding of the seasons and generations in a place, you may have missed something. That this one is actually a natural progression of every few years. So don't make big policy without understanding that and putting in language that has a caveat. Or don't have policy, very clearly, don't have policy that absolutely destroys subsistence living. Because if you put a ban on whaling, a ban on walrus, a ban on seals, which is important because those are people they overfish, they overkill, and they do it for for profit. But when you have Indigenous peoples who live there, and this is part of how they actually live, instead of having to pay, I kid you not, $10 for a gallon of milk, and for a steak from a bison in Montana, $20 for like this big, they live on the land. That's how they work. So having Indigenous peoples as part of these conversations protects the Indigenous people's way of life, but also informs these longer term pieces and just knowledge systems we may not have of how the ocean temperatures or what they see when they're out on the land or on the water. So the Central Arctic Ocean has a list of them. I didn't put them here, and I can probably try to send that, of some of the things that have come from that. But the big piece was also right for that one, is that they actually put a protection, they put a very Indigenous, I'd say an ethic for the Inuit is this precautionary principle. Take only what you need and stop. So the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement right now just says moratorium on fishing until we learn more from all this knowledge. So sometimes it's not like a specific idea. It's, and I say this a lot at Dartmouth, it's not just what we do, it's how we do it. It's the process of gathering the information makes it better. So, yeah.
In the midst of like the uncertainty regarding kind of like the current administration and how you showed like all the programs you're shutting down, what's the role of institutions like Dartmouth in kind of continuing some of this research?
That's weird. That was our meeting with the ambassador and a few folks this just Tuesday, Wednesday I brought them here. That's what we're discussing, and we discussed it in Colorado at a big meeting, but kind of quietly. It's very hard to. This is a challenging time. The role is to maintain the trusted relationships in the hopes that this administration may change its stance, and that can be maintained, and that this is maybe just as a reset. It's maybe a bit of a change, but we can maintain what we think trusted relationships bring you a stronger knowledge and again security. So it's called. There's actually something called like track 2 diplomacy. If you got it. That's this idea that you kind of stand in when the big players can't or have something else going on, that some of those folks embed in institutions like Dartmouth. We engage them. Maybe they become a senior Arctic fellow. I won't say if the press release will come out soon, with us, so that their knowledge doesn't go away, and we engage them sort of like both for our students. They get to come teach our students, but they also get to continue engaging in a different way with our partners, so that, let's say, the Inuit Circumpolar Council just doesn't have no one to talk to. So actually we're working with Harvard on this too. Harvard has an Arctic Institute. We're often rivals, like, oh, they're Arctic, Dartmouth, Harvard. No, in this case, how do institutions come together, protect each other? So how do we work with the University of Alaska system, where my dad worked? How do we make sure that they're safe, we're safe, and these Arctic programs and Arctic data systems, we can't do it alone at Dartmouth. So that's our role, is to reach out, keep the relationships internationally with Arctic Indigenous sovereign peoples and with our network, in hopes that we will come back to a place with the value systems that we think are really important. It's hard though. Yeah.
Can you talk about the difference between like cooperation, co-production, co-leadership, and co-management?
Yeah, they're all, and co-creation. So sometimes when you're working with folks, they don't want co-development. We need to be out co-creation, because you can't co-develop it. They created it, and now you're asking to co-develop. That's a power system. So they're all very different in terms of the timeline in which you engage. And they should go together, co-create, co-develop, co-manage, right? So, and there was one other, cooperation. So cooperation, I think is much more of a big term. It's like we are cooperating, but there's not the rules of engagement. And the rules of engagement come down to when you co-create, co-develop, co-manage. Are you truly equal? Or is there a power structure inherent? So example, if Dartmouth partners with a small community and we're going to co-develop, there's already a power imbalance that I probably have resources, they don't, I'm paid for it, they're not. So cooperation is, yes, we're cooperating, but when you start to talk about co-create, co-develop, co-manage, and those systems, you kind of have to have some rules of road so that you're not perpetuating power dynamics and inequalities that really don't get you the information you need. You're just overpowering things and causing more resentment. So does that help? Okay, here and then there. Yeah.
Okay, so I know you spoke about the areas in which Trump has cut Arctic funding.
Yeah.
But from our research, one area of which he stays really interested is the development of icebreakers.
Wow, how much? It was like 200. How was it? It was like 500.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot of money.
So,
$1 billion.
Two things.
Yes.
One, what do you perceive being the environmental impact of those icebreakers? And what do indigenous communities, do they have a stance on icebreakers?
Yeah. No, so on the latter half, and indigenous communities, again, I'm gonna go to the diversity. There could be some indigenous peoples who are actually, Craig Flinger, who's a very high-ranking military person in Alaska at the Ted Stevens Security Center for Arctic Studies, is Gwich'in. And so as a Gwich'in security officer, he so I think everyone realizes the mobility of the U.S. needed icebreakers. For us to have engagements there's obviously environmental issues, but just to be able to move around there, so there's pros and cons of that. But I think everyone's been like, everyone's wanted more icebreakers. Because right now the U.S. has had to be honest, we were borrowing them from Russia. Not a good idea. This has been a long time that I think everyone's excited to see this money. It's been in there for a while. The sad part is this money has come in and I think we would like to see the money there right? Because now it's just military. There's not a lot of, in fact, the knowledge, so when you use your icebreaker for a military purpose and when you just use it for other things is kind of lost if you've lost all the context around it. But putting that aside, I'd say most people are excited that there's investment. As to Arctic Indigenous peoples, it will be, I think, I can't speak for them. I'd say maybe some folks in the security space are like, about time. I think there's probably also some folks saying, that's great, that doesn't really help us. You didn't talk to us about that. So it's not an investment that was necessarily co-produced or co-developed. But I do think everyone recognized the U.S. was kind of back on its heels with outdated infrastructure. So.
Obviously there are pragmatic policy considerations, but on a theoretical level, do you think that there's a reason to prefer the method of co-production over just like handing leadership over to indigenous communities wholesale?
Gosh, such a good question. So the question was, is there something better about co-production versus just letting indigenous peoples run their own lives? Just so you know, Daley is very happy to, Dr. Daley Salvador and the other indigenous leaders, it took a while for this co-production idea, and they would really prefer to do it alone. We're a pain in the butt. They have to educate us. We're not indigenous, we don't really understand. We have to ask. We're holding it back, but we have the resource. A lot of us, unfortunately, we were sort of a piece to the resources of Dartmouth and NSF because we had folks on the panel who've done a lot of these grants. And so, but I put them top there because we were very clear that they were leading. We did not lead. We helped get the grants. We helped implement. But in this case, they were the leaders. Sarah Olsvig, the new chair of about to be stepping down of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, I was just on a call with her not too long ago. How do indigenous peoples fund, instead of waiting for the co-produce a fund with the U.S. government, because the U.S. government will often fund indigenous engagement with policy. I mean, these small communities of 30 to 600 people don't have that kind of money. And the next generation youth to get engaged and learn about it. So the scholarships, the federal grants, if those are drying up, even when they were there, you had to ask. That's not cool. Greenland doesn't want, again, we're for business but not for sale. The idea is that they want self-determination, not co-produced determination. So it's better to be self-determined. I would much rather live my life self-determined than have to ask someone for permission. So I would say, I'm not speaking for Indigenous peoples, but I will give you a very strong opinion that Arctic Indigenous peoples around the world would much prefer their own institutions. And the place that's doing this is Canada. Alaska a little bit. There's Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortia. They are dependent on federal funds. Canada's federal government, though, is funding Indigenous-led institutions that have co-equal leadership. They are funded by the Canadian government, but they have co-equal leadership. This came out of the Truth and Reconciliation work in Canada. Co-equal leadership at like a hospital, Indigenous-led hospital, and a Western-ish led hospital. So they are actually, the power structures are equal. So it's, but what a different world, right? I don't know how to get there either. Other questions? Listen to me. Yeah.
Could you sort of talk about how Indigenous knowledge can be integrated into like artificial intelligence to like better help climate change?
So this is where I'm learning. I don't know. I don't know. I will know more when I have Pole Arctic's leaders here to give a talk on how, and maybe some other folks from Indigenous knowledge systems, how those, they're often more narrative, right? Narrative knowledge systems, and it's not for me to figure out how they are integrated. Really, you need Indigenous leadership to do that. So I don't know how that's going to be done with machine learning. You really want Indigenous leaders and scholars who are computer science savvy, machine learning savvy, and they're bringing the knowledge with permission from elders, with permission from their communities, into these LLL, the large language, what's the other, LL, I can't remember. LL, yeah. So bringing those in with permission, and this is a big thing on Indigenous data too. So there are Indigenous data repositories. So how does AI go and scrape those and know to scrape those in a respectful way? It's not necessarily being respectful about other, but this is a whole new world of ethics and equity that I think, it's sort of like universal design when you do it for one group, is good for everyone. I think this idea of how we respect Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous data is, you're hearing, it's kind of like how we want to be treated. Everyone wants to be treated. So I don't know how. That's a really good thing to go look at though, if there are some papers on it. I'm waiting to still understand it. Oh. Yeah.
I was wondering, could you speak a little bit more? I know we obviously talked about how Indigenous groups are not like a monolith and
Right.
different separate independent nations, but like how they interact on the Arctic Council /
Okay.
like how often there are disagreements between Indigenous groups, obviously with
Such
like
a good
their
question.
self-interest.
The question is, yeah, interactions of the Indigenous peoples in the Arctic Council, and I'm very lucky to have been allowed to be an observer to some Arctic Council discussions in Rovaniemi in 2018. And when I did the UArctic Model Arctic Council here, Ed Alexander, who was a co-lead for the Gwich'in Council, came here to teach my students how to be an Indigenous participant. So I know because I had these opportunities. And one of the things that Ed said, as much as the Indigenous peoples are not a monolith, they also know if they're not in consensus, their power is weakened. So his advice to my Model Arctic Council delegates who were representing was, yeah, everyone's negotiating. You got always find time to go off and be one. You must not, united you stand, essentially, divided you fall. I don't know if that was his strategy. I don't know if all Indigenous folks would say that. Because, for example, Inuit Circumpolar Council leadership, she was just telling me, I was talking about this larger Arctic Indigenous piece, and Sarah was very clear, I have to think of the ICC first, then all other Arctic Indigenous peoples, because my role is to lead the Arctic Inuit Circumpolar Council. So fair. At the same time, I think when they get to something like the Arctic Council, they do try to keep their divisions somewhat there, because their power is that veto and holding together. So, yeah.
Wait, can I ask one more question?
No,
So
no.
what is the veto, like, because, I don't know,
Oh.
maybe I
No,
don't
no.
understand the Arctic Council obviously as well
No.
as you, but I didn't think it was like a policy-making group, so what
Oh.
does that veto actually look like in terms
Good
of
point.
like, what it informs?
So a lot of the stuff coming out are just resolutions, et cetera, but every once in a while, the Arctic Council goes to a treaty level. Okay. Because it has to, and I say veto, and I don't think the Indigenous people would call it a veto. they say, we can stop consensus from happening. Because it has to be consensus to come out as a unified directive of the Arctic Council, and right now it's not just, oh, we got 6 votes and they're bye guys, we're gonna put this out there. That's at least now not how the Arctic Council works. So as of now, and that's why they can't do anything, because Russia's not there. They're actually, if I had my druthers, I told you I'm opinionated, we might be the Arctic 7, but I've also been told when I say that, I get many ambassadors mad at me, so I had that happen in Iceland, they yelled at me, so it's okay. So I'm just like, let's get this done. But to wait for the consensus, when things come out that need a treaty level, so there was actually something called the Arctic Science Ministerial Agreement that came out of the US chairship. It was not just a resolution. They took it, said, we want this as an international agreement by all the holders, all the Arctic nations, so we'll have to go through their governments to ratify. They basically said, if it's not unratified, if they don't take it away in 2 years or 1 year, it goes into force. That was how they wrote it. So essentially this treaty on how we do Arctic science engagement, and this has happened also with some shipping issues and some sort of Arctic emergency preparedness, they went all the way to a treaty. There's only 4 or 5 out of the Arctic Council. Then they have to go to the governments of the Arctic nations, so they're now policy. The other ones are resolution policy, like the statements of, but these are actual elected, they have to go through the governments and be voted up or down essentially, with the caveat that if no one touches them, they'll go into force. Sort of like the Paris Climate Agreement and other things. So that's how that works. But they don't take everything that level. A lot of it, they sort of say, this is for the Arctic region. We don't need to go through all the governments. This is a resolution and people will abide by it. But every once in a while, they pop it all the way up to treaty status.
I think that maybe my understanding of how the Arctic Council functions may be a little bit like not super accurate, because as I understand it, they're participants, so they don't necessarily have a vote.
That's it.
Is that true?
Yeah,
Okay. So for like, in terms of veto power, and I know you just said you don't consider it veto power, would you say it's de facto veto power, or is there anything that is like official in any Arctic Council resolution that actually allows them to say we don't want this policy to pass, so it's not gonna pass?
Because they have permanent observer status, consensus can only be reached if those permanent observers agree with the Arctic nations. So that's the policy for consensus, that only things will move forward out of the Arctic Council if they are by consensus negotiation, and we actually have a consensus agreement. So that is the key that doesn't need votes, essentially, because it's not of who gets the most votes. So the Indigenous peoples, as a permanent participant, a permanent status, not just an observer. There's lots of, China's an observer, France is an observer, there's lots of observers. They don't get to have a say in decision making. As a permanent participant, that's the classification that Mary Simon said, unless we have that, we're out. As a permanent participant, those 6 Arctic Indigenous peoples have to be part of that consensus or we'll move forward. So that's the veto power. It means if they don't say yes, it does not move forward.
And has there ever been a case in which they didn't say yes and a policy did move forward?
Not yet. What has happened instead, and it was actually the US, wasn't Indigenous peoples. It was the US, I don't know if you, when Pompeo was Secretary of State, the words climate change were in the Arctic Declaration. And that was the first time, and actually the last one too, it was the first time there was not a joint consensus resolution out of the Arctic Council at the end of the chairship, because the US did not sign on anything with climate change. It almost happened in Alaska because the first Trump administration came in and the first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, was there for like 2 months, but he he almost stopped it because of the words climate change. It got through, squeaked through, and so that, but the next one, it went from US to Iceland, and the Trump administration by that time was like, no climate change. So it's only the actual loss of consensus in big documents coming out of the Arctic Council has only been so far, not the Indigenous peoples, but the US. Interestingly enough. We go back there first. Yeah.
So in debate, there's a lot of stuff or a lot of arguments that were like we say like, oh, like Indigenous people would like this specific policy to pass or would like this to happen. How should non-Indigenous people, I guess, defend or speak for what Indigenous people want in a respectful way?
Hopefully what I just did there, showing what Indigenous people have asked for in their own writing and their own voices. And to be honest, I did this when I was in Brussels, not too, fall of 2019, I think it was. I can't remember if it was after the pandemic, maybe it was after that, so it was 2022 maybe. But I was at a meeting the EU was hosting, and I talked about ethical, equitable engagements in all of our work in the Arctic. And Sarah Olsvig, who was zooming in, she couldn't come from Greenland, her next tweet was, awesome, thank you, you know, and that kind of started our relationship. So it is building trust by listening, knowing what's important to the folks with whom you're working, and you believe in too, and asking how you can help. So for example, right now, I wrote this paper on Arctic science diplomacy where I think we should have more Indigenous engagement in science, knowledge creation, and diplomacy, because current science diplomacy is very Western. Talked about it with Daly, Samodoro, also just talked with Sarah. I would love to have a declaration about it, but not without them. And she's basically like, don't have the time, go forward, let's see where we make this happen. So trying to find things where you have to have a partner. You have to go find and build trust. I know, it's hard. Or before that, go find things that have already been written and learn about them and talk about them. That's being a really powerful ally with the words from the Arctic peoples themselves. Here first.
I know a lot of what you've said and a lot of what I've read has emphasized that an important aspect of co-production is timing and respecting the timelines of Indigenous communities, extending deadlines past what they would normally be. How do you think that can be balanced with just like the fact of the urgency of the situation? How do you navigate?
So the question is, it takes time to build trust. It takes time to have speaking with elders and go back and forth, and yet the planet is burning up and we're having these existential crises. I believe so deeply in it that I'm still trying to forefront that, because I don't want the world, when we fix the world, I want that to be embedded. You kind of have to try to do both. So I am trying to move things forward and find allies and move it forward more quickly. There's not, I mean, Arctic Indigenous people know, I'm not saying that, they know it's now, it's happening. They want us, but there still is this respect. It may be a few months different. Maybe kind of put it in perspective, that those few months will make much better than if you've done it and now it all falls apart because everyone's like, yeah. So it's a balance. I'm sorry, I jumped back to, is it here? No, there's a question. We go up there.
Based on like what I've noticed in the Arctic Council, there's like 6 Indigenous permanent participants, right? Have you noticed or seen like kind of the inclination to increase or expand or like add more people in that kind of like consensus or?
No, because each of those, and I don't go into it when I teach this in my class, each of those groups, oh my gosh, the diversity of languages and peoples in them, it covers all of them. It actually does cover all, at least above the Arctic Circle. That doesn't mean that when we're doing work on Indigenous rights around the world, that those 6 groups don't also work with the Indigenous peoples of Peru or Tasmania. I mean, there's connections there that happen to the UN and other fora. But in the Arctic, those are the 6, and they try to encompass all of the Indigenous peoples in those 6. And they really do belong to those groups as their sovereign group, but they might, there's different Sami. The Sami has the North Sami, the Finnish Sami, the Norwegian Sami, different Sami councils. It's very complicated. It changes when you drive 100 miles, or whatever that is, 100 something kilometers. It's hard. I was just up with the Finnish Sami, reindeer Sami. There's also coastal Sami. There's also mountain Sami. And I don't know all of them. Right now I know I'm working on a project, a co-production with the Sami Education Institute, who are Finland, they're mostly in the forest, they're reindeer Sami. So that's what I'm learning about right now is reindeer Sami. I actually got to herd reindeer. Anyway, so that does encompass. Okay, so I'll go first here because I haven't spoken yet.
Okay, given everything that's happened with Russia recently, kind of like you said earlier, I guess one, do you think the U.S. will be able to further cooperate with Russia over like permafrost regions? And 2, do you think Russia will rejoin like this Arctic Council so that way we can have actually policies passed then, or not necessarily passed, but like.
such a big. So the question is, will Russia be able to engage back? And are there certain issues like permafrost where they should be cooperating because time's running out? It's kind of that whole thing. So not only does it take time, there's also a pause right now. So I'm part in the science diplomacy world. I'm in, just so you know, you've heard I'm opinionated. I'm actually Russia should not be allowed back until there's peace in Ukraine. That's me. I'm probably a very minor scientist. Most scientists like science is not about politics. Science is about climate change and existential. We have to share data. Science is universal. Melody, cut it out. So this happens a lot. I still believe this, just so you know. But I still believe where I am. But I respect those. That science and climate and permafrost should be beyond security and war issues. I don't believe that. I believe it's how we. But I won't go into that right now. What I'll say is there are actions right now to find places, and I'm supporting them, where we can build trust again, and permafrost is one of them. So climate change, permafrost, wildfires. Where can we build trust again with Russian scientists, Russian governments, and get the Arctic Council back into some sort of a working place? I'm much more slow, and I will tell you this is also because Russia's scientists must check in with their government and act as agents of information back to their government in ways that we don't have to. And I don't think the scientific community quite is aware of what intelligence, the dual use it's called, weaponization of information is happening. But that's been happening, to be honest. Pavel Susandiga, the man I mentioned, the leader of Raipon, who Putin wanted to kill, he said, Melody, it's always been that way. Russia's never cooperated. Russia's always been taking your information and using it for its own purposes. Thank you for coming to my party. That's basically Pavel. I'm not quite that cynical. I would like to, because I've traveled in Russia. We were about to take Model Arctic Council to Russia with US students and students from all over the world, 8 Dartmouth students. I want that cooperation, so I do want it. I do think you have to be savvy that there are some other structures in China and Russia that watch you differently when you're in those spaces, and that information can be challenging. But as long as you know that and you travel wisely, research can be done. Just being careful. It's not everyone believes that science is just open for everyone and for the good of the world. Sometimes people use it against you, and you just have to be, sorry, getting into a little bit of something I do on the other side, security. But it's a good question, and I would like to see the Arctic Council come back together.
So I want to go back to how you're talking about how Russia kind of like excludes the views of indigenous people in its region in the Arctic. How do you think that other, like the Arctic Council and other indigenous groups outside of Russia can help support indigenous people within those regions?
That's what they're doing. So the Inuit, the Sami tried, and actually some people were killed within Russia. So they stopped, and they stopped all engagement. But the Inuit still believe they can work, and the Aleut have cousins and kin in Russia, and have maintained connections. And they, again, the people on the ground, they are humans. Where it gets a little challenging is once you get to a political entity, and what they can and can't say, and what their position is it independent of Putin and the Kremlin, or does it need to go check through there, and if they in any way, shape, or form go against it, they might be killed. Those are two very different. So there are people trying to make those engagement and maintaining those. So the Inuit Sarah Olsvig is maintaining relationships with their Russian colleagues. As a sovereign group, she's like, there are people, they're my people. I'm not going to not talk with folks in Chukotka, Russia. And Jessica Velstra of Aleut International, she said, they're my people in Russia. She, however, is not getting a lot back from them right now. Actually, she was joking. She says, I'm the executive director forever. No one can oust me at the moment. I can't even step down because you need a consensus vote, and the Russians aren't showing up at their meetings. So it's both kind of funny, but it's also a challenging piece. And when I say Russians not including its indigenous peoples, there are some, Raipon would argue, no, we're the voice of the indigenous peoples. It's at the political level, some of the dissent, there is dissent who is saying, no, that's not true, and it's very complicated. So, yeah.
Okay, another Arctic Council question.
Sure.
I know you mentioned, or I thought the story that you told was really interesting about like one of the first people that was on the Arctic Council, and how she didn't necessarily trust the other members of the Arctic Council, like the countries on the Arctic Council, so set up the precedent.
Set up a press release, yeah.
And how they were planning to like basically reverse their decision about indigenous people. I guess like how has the trust been gained between Indigenous people and the nations on the Arctic Council?
It's fleeting.
It's fleeting.
Well, because if I were, I wouldn't. Our governance changes and people's change. And this was actually when we did Indigenizing Arctic Research, and Daly said, hey, we all should come together to try to change Arctic research in these Western spaces. They were like, it was kind of, you guys probably don't know Snoopy and Lucy in the football, that Lucy would always hold the football, and Charlie Brown kept trying to hit, and she'd always go, hi. And every time he had the trust that she was not going to hold the football and he could kick it, she'd always take, it's a cartoon, Peanuts. Anyway, they basically said, Daly, we love you, you've been a fantastic leader. Every time we take our time and our energy to do these things, we put it all in, we think we got it, and then they just like, oh, sort of like the Biden federal knowledge will have Indigenous knowledge. That was a lot of work. It could just be erased in 1 second. So, but I hope you still try to build trust at a personal level that keeps between these things. But maybe that wasn't your question, did I?
No, it kind of was.
Yeah.
It was more just like, how do they establish more of like a permanent, because you also alluded to the fact that Indigenous people have a lot of power and
Yeah.
veto essentially. How did the structure go from them almost not even being able to be observers to them like having a veto power or having some sort of power?
I think there was enough, I think what Mary Simon and Caleb Pungawi and others in the early days, they were hearing people wanted this, and it would be seen as really, this was a time for Indigenous knowledge engagement, respect, and ethic. There was, I think this was time in the civil rights movements and other things, and they were realizing this needed to change. I think they took advantage of the moment that there was kind of a time that they could say this, and that would look really bad for the governments. So the governments responded. There's other times where people are like, okay, walk away, we don't need you. So it's kind of a time, I don't know what would happen now. I'm actually very worried that the US and Russia could ignore the Arctic Council and Indigenous peoples, and similar to what we saw in Ukraine, at least at the beginning, how do we just divvy it up? And Zelensky wasn't even involved, right, at first. How do we divvy this up and finish this? So there's a great powers concern I have for the Arctic, that places like the US and Russia could say, ignore the Arctic Council. I say they have power, but they only have power if you respect the process. If you don't respect the process and you just use military warships, it could go, all of these systems are things that only exist because we believe in them. If you think about it, no one, there's some words on paper, but even then it's words on paper. You have to have people to enforce it. You have to have people believing in these systems, so it's really hard. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could talk more about how Indigenous knowledge ties into security.
Yeah, Indigenous knowledge and security. To me, it's a very, very security term, situational awareness. And in fact, we have the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory about a mile up from here. That's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Its whole work, and maybe this goes to the Indigenous knowledge piece too, its whole work is to secure the battlefield for U.S. military to be safe and not lose as many lives, and to get through an Arctic conflict without as many casualties and win. That's battlefield awareness. One of the things they were doing was an Indigenous knowledge holder who worked in Greenland with an Indigenous knowledge holder in Greenland on Arctic plants, understood how they grow, understood, she was using she just left there, but she was using her knowledge of Arctic plants and tundra to understand how it would respond if, let's say, a tank went over it or something went over it, so you could actually use certain sensors on that kind of plant. So you take Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge of the plant growth and having a sense of the land and its growth cycle, put those together, so you actually, your sensors can now understand the landscape if it had been traumatized, if it had been changed by military activities, if IEDs were present. So it's this idea that you actually are thinking about the space and the land in a different way that brings situational awareness of your lands and your waters from people who know these spaces. And those are more eyes on the ground. I mean, to me, if you saw where the Indigenous peoples are in that arc, that's where ballistic missiles come, that's where nuclear submarines would be. Don't you want those people at the front lines to be your allies? Watching and waiting and sending word? I would. So it's an awareness, and then being trained up to push back as well. Maybe even, misinformation and pushing back before they get here. So they're human assets. It's another human asset. Yeah.
Is there anything
lot of readings on. I gave a talk on this in Canada, but I mostly cited what Canada's been doing in trying to not alienate when they put more infrastructure. So there's some Canadian documents of putting more infrastructure of security up in the north again, and US is doing this too. Lots of money going up north. How do we do that without alienating the people who live there? So if I'll see if I have some documents, but that's really the key. Finland, for example, my guy ranger herder I'm working with, some ranger herders, he was gonna come here I'm doing New York Climate Week and I wanted his voice. He was very excited to come here, Jan Nakalaami, and he just told me he can't come because the Finnish government has just pulled him up for military games because of Russia. So he's only about 50 miles from the Russian border.
What's your opinion on trying to establish yourself as a New York state? And like,
I'm sorry, one more time.
what's your opinion on trying to establish yourself as like a New Arctic? And do you think that's going to change the dynamics in the Arctic Confederation?
So the first part, I guess the second part's in here as well, but the first part, what's my opinion on Arctic as China as a New Arctic state? I'm not at all happy. I actually had a Fulbright China Arctic scholar here with me who announced it when he was here. It was interesting. I love him, Kaisung, but not that this Polar Silk Road and they're a New Arctic state. No, they're not. They're not in and of and for the Arctic. So, but the second part?
Like, do you think that's going to change any of the dynamics there with indigenous people?
I think the U.S. I've been in non-classified intelligence briefings and gone down to D.C. to be part of them. In those, it's very clear. Yeah, Russia, Ukraine, not good. Be careful, but it's China that people are worried about, and it's the China plus Russia. China's investment in the Russian military infrastructure, oil and gas. That's the concern of the United States. First and foremost, Russia second, if that makes sense. It could have changed since the administration. I haven't gone back. I have not been invited to brief this administration, but as I said, my colleague who I'm keeping close is being invited to do so. So I'm trying to keep it bipartisan. And I hope I am bipartisan, but maybe my history working for a senator may tag me as not. And my social media, actually. But anyway, but no, I think that's been consistent. From my conversation, and I do still work with the State Department Arctic Office, and China's a huge piece of that, first and foremost.
Do you know if Arctic indigenous peoples are aware of the more modern theorization and abstraction of settler colonial theory in academia, and how do they feel about it?
Yeah, again, it's kind of a broad of how does people feel. It probably depends on the indigenous. There are some indigenous scholars here in our Native American Indigenous Studies, due to Lydia Jennings. We hired environmental science on indigenous data sovereignty. They might have very different views on that. That said, the decolonization settler theory idea, I think in general there's so it's not really a theory. The general idea that our structures are too Western and they need to be decolonized and understand the settler and push settlers maybe out and recognize the folks, the people who had first rights there. That I think is probably, you'd mostly find agreement with that. As to all of the theories, the details, I couldn't necessarily tell you because it moves from sort of pragmatic to activist, and that's good. I mean, I agree with all of you need all of those pieces to make policy work. You need activists out there. You need sort of people trying to negotiate. You need people who kind of want to let's just do it as we're doing. My guess is my colleagues here are probably in sort of they could be in the activist space, but I think they're probably trying to, I shouldn't speak for them. I think there's all those spaces and I don't know, but everyone's aware of it, yes. Then where they fall in their position to it would probably be, and when I say aware of it, folks who are in academia, indigenous scholars in academia who are thinking about these indigenous issues. So would a community in Alaska, would I know about it before I became the Institute of Arctic Studies director? Probably not, yeah.
In the slideshow, I saw a lot of female leaders, especially village presidents, and I was wondering if that leadership also translates on the Arctic Council.
Yes, and that's a good question. I haven't thought about it, trying to count them up in my head. But yes, actually there's a lot of female leadership, and I will say some of the issues we're dealing with right now about men feeling left behind, I actually heard first in the Arctic. about a lot of men's roles in Arctic Indigenous communities was to hunt and fish. And not that women didn't also hunt and fish. I have many women Arctic Indigenous people I know who hunt and fish too, but it had been traditionally in that space. And when that was like shut down by treaties or whatever, that there was kind of like a and a lot of the women's skills, which were more communal, translated into them moving to a city for, right? Or education system that's very structured. So, and I have 2 boys, so anyway, this idea that kind of we're not necessarily, I think we need to elevate women, we need to elevate men, we need to elevate everyone, and this is a good course correction, but women have been powerful in Arctic Indigenous communities for a very long time and are respected, and then there's a whole elders, the elders are both men and women. So, yeah, it's actually, I would almost say it's either even or more women from what I can see.
What is the incentive for a country to become an observer state on the Arctic Council?
Oh, you get to, so if you saw one of those pictures, there's all this people in there, there's coffee breaks. There's time in the bathroom, you get to go for a walk together. Influence, voice in an ear, proximity to power and decision making. When you're an observer, you're hearing everything's going on, you're hearing the decisions, you're hearing the internal discussions of what's good. You hear a coalition. I mean, they don't have to vote or whatever. They're still going to, they're not going to not disagree. There's going to be some internal discussion. That's what the council gets. They get together to talk and have these side meetings and do all these things. If you're an observer, you get to watch all of it. You now understand what's going on. And then when everyone gets up to go get their coffee break, you might get coffee and say, hey, yeah, it's powerful to be an observer.
So even if there's not any official capacity, there's still
knowledge. Information is power. And you might say, hey, do you need some money for that project? It's capped at 30% from non-Arctic peoples. They've capped it because they know money is power. Because right now, let's say, another observer come and say, I'm funding all of this for you. And people it's hard not to be beholden to somebody who funds all of it for you. So it's capped at 30%. But observers are allowed to fund and be part of those, also part of those expert groups. Observers can nominate people to some of those expert groups and the working groups. That's actually they know they're not making decisions at the ministerial, the policy level, but they can watch it all and whisper, and use their influence, and then at the working group, expert group level, they're also involved.